The alien fleet hung motionless in low orbit, casting long shadows over Earth's surface. Their sleek warships, bristling with energy weapons, pulsed with an eerie blue glow. From the bridge of the Viethuan, the command ship, Overlord Xyrix studied the projections before him with an expression of amusement. The primitive planet below had nothing to offer but outdated ballistics, slow-moving war machines, and a species that still relied on gunpowder. This would not be a battle, it would be a culling. "Begin the assault," Xyrix ordered, his voice a low vibration that sent his subordinates scurrying. Within minutes, plasma-laced orbital bombardments struck military installations across the planet. Fighter squadrons streaked through the skies, meeting little resistance as Earth's defenses scrambled in disarray. Energy shields, impervious to conventional missiles, absorbed what few counterattacks the humans managed to launch. Reports streamed in, targets obliterated, armored divisions wiped out, aircraft swatted from the sky. Xyrix exhaled in satisfaction. This was hardly worth the effort. On the ground, the devastation was absolute. Smoke choked the horizon, and the acrid scent of burning metal mixed with the unmistakable stench of death. Scattered resistance held on in pockets, but they were outmatched. The invaders moved through the wreckage with the confidence of an apex predator, their exoskeletal armor gleaming beneath the fires they had ignited. The humans fought back with rifles and tanks, their outdated machines barely making a dent against the superior technology that opposed them. The arrogance of the aliens was absolute. Sergeant Jack "Ghost" Reynolds watched through his high-powered optic as a squad of them marched across the ruins of an airbase, casually executing survivors. He didn't move, didn't make a sound. He lay nestled in the jagged remains of a collapsed tower, his ghillie suit blending him seamlessly into the ash-streaked rubble. Next to him, Corporal Diaz breathed steadily, adjusting the rangefinder attached to his spotting scope. "They're laughing at us," Diaz muttered. His voice was barely above a whisper. Reynolds watched as one of the aliens, a high-ranking officer by the insignia carved into its armor, lifted a captured Marine by the throat. The struggling soldier fought to pry himself free, but the alien crushed his windpipe with an effortless squeeze, dropping the body like discarded trash. The squad laughed, a series of guttural clicks and growls that needed no translation. Reynolds' jaw tightened, but his breathing remained controlled. He had seen slaughter before. He had watched war break men. But this wasn't just war, this was humiliation. And the aliens reveled in it. "Distance?" Reynolds asked, his voice a blade's edge. 800 meters, Diaz answered, adjusting the windage. "You got an angle?" Reynolds exhaled slowly, centering his reticle on the officer's elongated skull. The armor they wore was tough, plasma-resistant, energy-absorbing. But it had weaknesses. Every suit had joints, gaps, and vulnerabilities. It was just a matter of finding them. His fingers settled on the trigger of his M82 Barrett. The rifle was an antique compared to the weaponry the enemy wielded, a relic of old-world warfare. But it didn't need to be modern to kill. He squeezed the trigger. The crack of the shot split the air. The .50 BMG round traveled the distance in a blink, striking the officer just beneath the helmet's lower edge. The effect was instant. The alien's head snapped back, a mist of dark, viscous blood erupting from the exit wound. His body crumpled, twitching. For the first time since they had landed, the enemy hesitated. The other aliens jerked toward the fallen officer, their amusement vanishing. They scanned the ruins, confused. They had fought resistance, but not like this. Not with a single, unseen enemy capable of eliminating a leader with surgical precision. Diaz didn't need prompting to confirm the kill. Through the throat, out the back of the skull. "He's done." The aliens barked orders, scattering for cover. One of them fired wildly into the ruins, plasma bolts scorching through the remains of the tower. Reynolds and Diaz didn't move. "Think they're scared?" Diaz murmured. Reynolds chambered another round, watching the disarray unfold. "Not yet. But they will be." The aliens had no concept of this kind of warfare. Their entire doctrine was built around overwhelming firepower, planetary bombardment, and technological supremacy. They had no experience with an enemy who could kill them from half a mile away without ever being seen. Xyrix was furious. The war reports had painted a predictable picture. Earth's forces shattered, resistance crushed. Yet here was something unexpected, something beneath his notice that had somehow disrupted the perfect march of their conquest. One shot had changed the battlefield. He stood at the command deck of the Viethuan, watching live feeds of his soldiers scrambling for cover. His officers whispered among themselves, uneasy. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. "Find the source," Xyrix growled. "End it." On the ground, the aliens deployed scanning drones, their sleek forms humming as they scoured the wreckage. Heat signatures, motion tracking, atmospheric disturbances, every form of detection they had at their disposal. Reynolds had anticipated this. He had moved before they had even fired their first return shot. The moment his first round connected, he and Diaz had repositioned, slipping through the ruins like ghosts. The drones passed over their previous location, detecting nothing. The enemy was looking for signs of movement, of sound, of anything to give them a target. There was none. They wouldn't fight the way the aliens expected them to. They think they're gods, Diaz muttered as they settled into a new position. Reynolds adjusted his scope. We'll show them they bleed like the rest of us. The aliens were still clustered, still searching for a tangible threat. Their armor may have been resistant to energy-based attacks, but it was not impervious to solid lead traveling at high velocity. Reynolds picked his next target. Another officer, barking orders, pointing toward the ruins. He fired. The bullet struck center mass, tearing through the alien's chest. It staggered, gasping, before crumpling. The remaining soldiers panicked, firing blindly into the ruins. They didn't understand where the attacks were coming from. The concept of an unseen killer striking from beyond their range was foreign to them. Reynolds and Diaz moved again. Another body fell. Then another. Each kill sent a ripple of fear through the ranks. They had come expecting a slaughter. Instead, they had become the hunted. Xyrix clenched his fists as the reports came in. His soldiers were dying and they didn't even know from where. The humans had no energy shields, no plasma weapons, no mechanized war suits. And yet, in the span of minutes, an elite unit had been reduced to a panicked, disorganized mass. This was no accident. This was calculated. The battlefield had changed, and for the first time, Xyrix felt something creeping in at the edges of his mind. Uncertainty. Reynolds adjusted his rifle and lined up another shot. They had mocked Earth's weapons. They had laughed at its soldiers. They weren't laughing anymore. The alien soldier collapsed before his comrades could even register what had happened. A clean shot through the eye socket. The round had shattered bone, pulped tissue, and exited in a spray of dark arterial fluid. The body twitched, fingers spasming against the trigger of its useless rifle before going still. For a few long seconds, the remaining aliens stood frozen, their earlier bravado snuffed out like a candle. Then panic set in. Shouts in their guttural, clacking language rang out as they scrambled for cover. Their armor was supposed to be impenetrable. Their technology unmatched. And yet, here they were, falling one by one to an enemy they couldn't see, against a weapon they had dismissed as obsolete. Reynolds chambered another round. The slow, practiced motion of his hands was muscle memory now, his heartbeat steady. Through the scope, he watched their formation crumble. Good. Fear was a weapon just as much as the .50 BMG in his hands. 3 confirmed, 4th one's bleeding out, Diaz whispered, tracking the movement through his spotting scope. They're scared, man. You can smell it. Reynolds let out a slow breath. They should be. He swept his reticle across the battlefield, searching for the next highest-ranking officer. These aliens weren't just soldiers. They were part of a rigid command structure, and without leadership they'd break like brittle glass. The trick wasn't just killing them, it was making sure they knew they were being hunted. One of the larger aliens, its crimson-marked armor denoting rank, was barking orders, gesturing wildly for his squad to fan out. His mistake. The moment he exposed himself from behind a chunk of ruined concrete, Reynolds fired. The round caught the alien at the base of its throat. Its energy shielding flickered uselessly as the kinetic force of the impact tore through flesh and spine. It crumpled mid-command, choking on its own blood. The rest of them lost whatever nerve they had left. The thing about being hunted was that it stripped away rational thought. The second their commander fell, discipline shattered. A few fired wildly into the ruins. Others activated scanning devices, frantically searching for heat signatures, movement, anything. But Reynolds and Diaz were already gone, slipping back through the wreckage like ghosts. A panicked alien turned too sharply, its foot catching on a collapsed girder. The stumble was small, but it was enough. Another soldier, already jittery, mistook the movement for an attack and fired. A plasma bolt lanced through the air, catching his own comrade square in the side. Diaz let out a breathy chuckle. They're shooting each other now. Reynolds said nothing, only watching. The aliens were fracturing faster than he had anticipated. He had seen men break under pressure before, but these creatures weren't just breaking, they were unraveling. The aliens had no counter-sniper doctrine. Their technology had made them lazy, dependent on scanners and energy-based tracking. They expected warfare to be fought in the open, where overwhelming force and superior firepower crushed all opposition. This was different. This was psychological. From the moment that first shot cracked through the air, they had lost control of the battlefield. And they knew it. Zyrex was pacing. His claws flexed in agitation, carving deep grooves into the metal railing of the command deck. It had been hours since his troops had deployed, and what should have been a routine operation had devolved into chaos. The humans had no orbital defense grid, no warships, no energy shielding. And yet his warriors, his best, were dying, their bodies left crumpled in the dirt like broken dolls. He had dismissed the reports at first. Impossible. The humans fought with outdated projectile weapons, relics of a past age. But the corpses piling up said otherwise. Overlord. One of his subordinates hesitated before stepping forward, posture rigid with fear. We have confirmed losses of 3 officers and... I know the numbers, Zyrex growled, his patience razor thin. What I want is an explanation. The subordinate hesitated. It appears to be a single unit. Zyrex's slit-pupiled eyes narrowed. 1 human? Possibly 2. A spotter perhaps. But yes, 1 shooter. A deep, dangerous silence settled over the bridge. The officers around him shifted uneasily, none daring to meet their overlord's gaze. Zyrex turned toward the battlefield display. The grainy, static-laced footage from ground units told a grim story. His warriors weren't just being killed, they were being hunted. They had sent distress signals. Some had abandoned formation entirely. This wasn't war. This was a culling. Zyrex exhaled slowly, a long, controlled breath that barely restrained his fury. The humans were weak, primitive, insignificant. And yet, this one was making his warriors afraid. Unacceptable. He slammed a fist onto the console. Deploy counter-sniper measures. I want that human found. Drones hummed as they deployed in coordinated sweeps, their sensors combing through the ruins in methodical grids. The aliens adjusted their tactics, moving in tighter formations, leapfrogging between cover. Their confidence was gone, replaced with grim determination. Reynolds observed all of this through his scope. They were adapting, slowly but surely. He watched as they moved in staggered patterns, minimizing exposure. The drones were an issue, scanning for heat signatures, attempting to flush him out. But they were still relying on technology to solve a human problem. You seeing this? Diaz murmured, shifting slightly to avoid the glare of a passing drone. They're learning. They think technology will save them. Reynolds adjusted his aim, tracking one of the drones as it hovered near a collapsed building. Let's show them it won't. The drone hovered for a fraction of a second too long. Reynolds took the shot. The high-caliber round tore through the sensor module, sending it spiraling in a burst of sparks. Immediately the aliens reacted, snapping their weapons toward the sound. Plasma fire rained down, melting concrete, vaporizing steel beams. But Reynolds and Diaz were already repositioning, slipping through a gap in the ruins. The aliens advanced cautiously, their formation tighter now. The more they huddled, the easier it was to spread panic. Reynolds slowed his breathing, steadying the rifle. The wind was picking up, he adjusted for it. The next shot had to be perfect. Another officer came into view, scanning the battlefield, mandibles clicking in frustration. Reynolds squeezed the trigger. The bullet struck center mass, but this time the officer's armor absorbed part of the impact. It stumbled, wounded but alive. For a brief moment the aliens had hope. Then Reynolds fired again. The second shot found the gap between plates, shattering bone, rupturing vital organs. The officer fell, gurgling. And just like that, hope died. The squad hesitated. The fear returned. They had thought they had adapted. Thought they had regained control. But control was an illusion. Reynolds chambered another round. Zyrex watched the feed in silence. His jaw was clenched so tight his fangs ached. One human. One insignificant soldier had thrown an entire operation into chaos. He had underestimated them. That mistake would not be made again. His claws flexed, curling into a fist. The drones had failed. The foot soldiers had failed. It was time for something more direct. He turned to his officers. Prepare the hunter squads. This ends now. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid stench of scorched earth. Fire crackled somewhere in the distance, the remnants of another skirmish lost to the aliens' initial bombardment. Reynolds lay motionless beneath the shattered remains of a collapsed highway, his rifle nestled into the crook of his shoulder, its bipod buried in the rubble. Diaz crouched beside him, one eye pressed to his spotting scope, his breath slow and measured. The enemy was moving differently now. No longer the overconfident conquerors marching in open ranks, they advanced in tight formations, leapfrogging between cover. Their drones prowled overhead, sweeping the ruins with infrared and motion sensors. Their officers barked clipped commands, and for the first time since the invasion began, they weren't laughing. "They're learning," Diaz muttered, adjusting the rangefinder. "They think that'll save them." Reynolds barely moved his lips as he spoke, his eyes steady through the scope. "They're still predictable." Predictability was a death sentence in war. The aliens still relied on technology, still expected scanners and drones to do the work of real soldiers. But war wasn't fought by machines. It was fought by men willing to crawl through mud, wait hours without moving, and pull a trigger at the right moment. Reynolds focused on an alien officer crouched behind the rusted carcass of a truck, issuing orders through a holographic display. His armor gleamed under the harsh red glow of a nearby fire. Smart. The bastards had finally started wearing reinforced plating over their vulnerable joints. Didn't matter. Reynolds exhaled, centered the crosshairs just beneath the officer's raised arm and squeezed the trigger. The bullet ripped through the exposed gap in the armor. The officer jerked violently, his weapon clattering to the ground. A strangled noise escaped his mandibles before he slumped forward, blood pooling beneath his twitching form. The squad froze. Then the panic started again. Diaz let out a quiet chuckle. "They really don't like that, do they? They weren't trained for this." Reynolds was already shifting position. He never took two shots from the same location. That was how amateurs got killed. The remaining aliens scrambled for cover, their movements erratic, undisciplined. Their formation fractured again, soldiers breaking off in pairs to fan out and search the ruins. That was another mistake. They thought they were hunting a sniper. They had no idea they were being funneled into an ambush. A distant explosion rocked the ground, sending a plume of fire into the sky. A half-second later, gunfire erupted, controlled bursts of high-caliber rounds tearing through the alien ranks. The rest of the Marine Scout sniper teams had arrived. Reynolds listened to the brief but brutal engagement unfolding across the city's skeletal remains. Short, disciplined bursts of rifle fire. The heavier thump of designated marksman rounds. The occasional crack of another .50 caliber sniper taking out a high-value target. The aliens had expected to fight a conventional army. Instead, they were being torn apart by unseen hunters striking from the shadows. A nearby comm channel crackled to life in his earpiece. "Ghost, this is Reaper 2. Targets engaged. We've got them on the run." "Copy," Reynolds murmured. He lined up another shot and sent a round through the visor of a soldier attempting to regroup. The body crumpled like a puppet with its strings cut. The battle was shifting. What had started as an invasion was becoming a war of attrition, and the aliens were bleeding for every step they took. But Xyrix was not a fool. He saw the pattern now. His forces weren't just being harassed, they were being systematically dismantled. He stood in the war room of the Vithuan, his claws flexing against the cold metal railing as he watched the reports come in. Another unit lost. Another officer dead. Another assault pushed back. These weren't random acts of defiance. This was strategy. The humans had no orbital superiority, no mechanized divisions, no energy shielding. But they had something else. Something older. Something the Xyrixian Empire had not faced in centuries. Guerrilla warfare. And it was working. His mandibles clicked together in irritation. He could no longer afford to treat this as an occupation. If he allowed these tactics to continue, the losses would mount, and soon even his own forces would begin to question their superiority. Xyrix turned to his second-in-command. "Deploy the hunter squads." The officer hesitated. "My lord, those are..." "Now." Xyrix's voice was steel. The hunter squads were not standard infantry. They were not reliant on scanners or bulky energy weapons. They were Xyrix's personal hand-selected killers, silent, efficient, bred for war. And unlike the rest of his forces, they understood how to track prey. Reynolds and Diaz had relocated again, deep within the skeleton of an abandoned skyscraper. The city was little more than a graveyard now, its ruins bathed in the orange glow of fires still burning from the initial invasion. Something felt different. The aliens had stopped advancing recklessly. The usual panic, the desperate scrambling, had gone quiet. Diaz frowned, peering through his spotting scope. "Something's off." Reynolds nodded. He had sensed it too. The way the battlefield had stilled, the way the enemy had stopped breaking formation so easily. They weren't just reacting anymore. They were waiting. "They're adapting," Reynolds murmured. Diaz tensed. "Then we need to move." The words had barely left his mouth when something streaked past their position. Silent, fast, almost invisible in the darkness. A blur of movement, barely caught by the edge of Reynolds' vision. Then a body hit the ground. Not one of theirs. One of the aliens. But this one was different. Leaner. Darker armor. No visible energy shielding, no bulky plasma rifle. Just a sleek, bladed weapon protruding from its wrist. Reynolds' stomach twisted with a realization. These weren't soldiers. They were assassins. Before he could react, a second figure moved. This time it wasn't a blur. It was there, right in front of him, moving through the rubble with terrifying speed. Reynolds barely had time to twist away as a blade slashed through the air, carving deep into the concrete where his head had been. He fired on instinct, but the figure was already gone, slipping into the shadows. Diaz cursed, spinning his rifle toward another movement. Another alien, this one moving with the same unnatural grace, darted forward. Diaz fired, the round catching it in the shoulder. The thing hissed, staggering back, but it didn't fall. Instead, it vanished into the ruins, melting into the darkness. Reynolds pushed himself upright, back against the half-collapsed wall. His rifle was still in his grip, but for the first time since this fight began, he felt a rare, unwelcome sensation. He was being hunted. The rules had changed. The aliens weren't relying on brute force anymore. They weren't marching in lines, weren't scanning from a safe distance. These new ones, these hunters, were tracking them the old way. By scent. By instinct. By patience. It was a test. A game of skill and endurance. Reynolds tightened his grip on his rifle and exchanged a look with Diaz. No words needed to be spoken. The battlefield had changed. So they would change with it. The ruins of the city had become a hunting ground. The fire still smoldered, casting long, flickering shadows across shattered streets and crumbling buildings. The air was thick with the scent of burning metal and scorched flesh. Somewhere in the distance, the echoes of distant gunfire cracked through the silence. Other Marine teams still fighting, still resisting. But here, in the depths of the war-torn wasteland, it was quiet. Too quiet. Reynolds lay prone, his rifle steady against his shoulder, breath slow and measured. Diaz was beside him, eyes locked on his spotting scope, scanning the darkness. Neither of them spoke. Words weren't necessary anymore. They weren't the hunters now. They were the hunted. Something moved through the wreckage ahead. Not the clumsy, heavy footfalls of the standard alien infantry. These steps were calculated, soft, deliberate. Reynolds didn't need to see them to know they were there. He could feel them. Stalking. Waiting. The hunter squads had been patient. Too patient. That was the part that unnerved him. They hadn't rushed in. They hadn't panicked. They had waited for Reynolds and Diaz to settle in, to believe they were safe before closing the noose. A glint of movement, a flicker of light against a curved blade. Reynolds shifted his aim an inch to the right and squeezed the trigger. The .50 caliber round tore through the wall of a burned-out building, shattering stone and steel, but the target was already gone. The bastard had moved, asterisk before asterisk Reynolds had fired. Fast. Too fast. Shit, Diaz muttered. They know the rifle now. Reynolds understood instantly. These weren't mindless grunts. They had learned his patterns. Studied his shots. They knew how he hunted, how he lined up kills. They were using his own tactics against him. For the first time since the invasion began, Reynolds felt something close to admiration. They're good, he murmured. Diaz exhaled. Yeah, but we're better. A sound, sharp, metallic, came from behind. Not a footstep. A weapon being drawn. Reynolds rolled, just as a blade cut through the air where his throat had been. He brought his rifle up instinctively, but the alien assassin was already moving, closing the distance in a blur. The thing was fast, impossibly fast, and for the first time in this war, Reynolds didn't have range on his side. The alien struck, its wrist blade slashing downward. Reynolds twisted, using the rifle to block the blow. Sparks flew as steel met alien alloy. The force behind the strike was immense, inhuman. The impact sent Reynolds skidding back, his boots grinding against loose rubble. Diaz fired. A single, controlled burst from his sidearm. The shots caught the alien in the side, punching through the softer armor beneath its ribs. It hissed but didn't fall. Instead, it turned, pivoting with the grace of a predator, and lunged toward Diaz. Reynolds reacted on instinct. He let go of the rifle, drew his combat knife, and drove it into the assassin's side as it passed. The blade sank deep, twisting between armor plates, and the alien screamed, a horrible gurgling noise as dark viscous blood spilled down its side. It staggered, stumbled, but didn't fall. Reynolds didn't give it the chance to recover. He grabbed the thing by the back of the skull and slammed its head into the jagged remains of a concrete barrier. The crunch of breaking bone echoed through the ruins. The alien's body went still. Diaz exhaled sharply. One down. Not enough, Reynolds muttered. More were coming. He could feel them, shadows shifting along the edges of broken walls, circling, testing weaknesses. They wouldn't make the same mistakes as their fallen comrade. No more direct attacks. They would pick at them, wear them down. Death by 1,000 cuts. They had to move. Reynolds grabbed his rifle, shouldering it as he and Diaz slipped deeper into the ruins. The city was a maze of destruction, collapsed highways, gutted skyscrapers, debris-strewn avenues. It was the perfect battlefield for what was coming next. A war of ghosts. They moved fast, weaving through the wreckage, keeping low. Every so often, Reynolds caught glimpses of movement, figures slipping through the darkness, always just out of reach. They weren't retreating. They were hurting him and Diaz, forcing them into a kill zone. A stretch of open ground loomed ahead, an intersection cleared by the initial invasion bombardments. A kill box. Reynolds saw it for what it was, but they had no choice. "We make a break for that wrecked transport," he whispered, nodding toward the remains of an overturned military truck on the far side. "On my mark." Diaz nodded. Reynolds took a breath. "Go." They sprinted. The first shot came from above, a sniper perched somewhere in the ruins. The plasma bolt sizzled past Reynolds' head, close enough that he felt the heat against his skin. Another shot. Then another. The air filled with the sharp crack of energy weapons. Plasma fire rained down, scorching the pavement as Reynolds and Diaz zigzagged, keeping their movements erratic. Reynolds reached the transport first, sliding into cover behind the armored hull. Diaz wasn't far behind, dropping low beside him. "They're pinning us," Diaz growled. "Not for long." Reynolds unslung his rifle. "Find me that sniper." Diaz was already on it, peering through his spotting scope. South Tower, 3rd floor. Partial cover behind a broken column. Reynolds adjusted his aim. The alien sniper had made one critical mistake. He had stopped moving star. Reynolds took the shot. The .50 BMG round punched through the column, through armor, through flesh. The sniper's body tumbled from its perch, hitting the ground with a wet, heavy thud. Silence. For the briefest moment, the enemy hesitated. Then Reynolds heard it. A low, guttural snarl. Not panic. Not fear. Rage. Something moved in the darkness. Faster than anything they had faced so far. A blur of motion, closing the distance in seconds. And then Xyrix was there. The overlord of the invasion force, the architect of Earth's destruction, stood before them. But he was not the detached commander of warships and strategies. He was something else now. A warrior. His armor was different from his soldiers, sleek, battle-worn, bearing the scars of 100 campaigns. His eyes burned with fury, but there was something else behind them. Recognition. "You," Xyrix snarled. His voice was thick with disdain. "The ghost in the ruins." Reynolds rose slowly, his grip tightening on his rifle. Xyrix drew a massive blade from his back, the edges humming with energy. "I have lost too many to your coward's war," he spat. "No more hiding. No more shadows. You will die now." Reynolds smirked. Big talk for a guy who just lost half his army to a couple of primitives. Xyrix lunged. Reynolds barely dodged the first strike, rolling to the side as the alien's blade carved through the truck's metal hull like paper. He fired point blank, but Xyrix moved with unnatural speed, twisting out of the bullet's path. This wasn't like the others. This wasn't a soldier or a hunter. This was a duel. Xyrix struck again, faster this time. Reynolds barely got his knife up in time, deflecting the blow just enough to keep his head attached. The force of it sent him stumbling. Diaz fired from the side, trying to draw Xyrix's attention. The overlord caught the bullet with his gauntlet, the impact barely phasing him. Reynolds saw his opening. He dropped to one knee, bracing his rifle against the ground. The barrel leveled with Xyrix's chest. The overlord turned, too slow. Reynolds pulled the trigger. The round tore through Xyrix's chest, exiting in a spray of dark ichor. The overlord staggered, his weapon slipping from his grasp. He looked down at the wound, eyes wide with disbelief. Then he fell. Silence. Reynolds exhaled. Diaz let out a breathless laugh. It was over. The invaders would retreat. The war would not be won today, but it would not be lost either. Humanity had made its stand. And the galaxy had learned a lesson. Never underestimate a Marine.